There's broad consensus, Democrats, independents, Republicans, that DACA ought to pass, and I hope the courts will uphold that.
It's Wednesday, November 13th. I'm Julie Pace, Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. The fate of the Dreamers goes to the Supreme Court.
Home is here! Home is here!
The justices heard oral arguments yesterday on the Trump administration's efforts to end protections for nearly 700,000 immigrants brought to the U.S. illegally as children. And all eyes were on one man, Chief Justice John Roberts. Then, how late is too late to jump into the presidential race? Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick want to know.
We had to register in Alabama and here because of the time frames, so it doesn't mean we're going to run, but we do that to make sure that we're on the ballot if we do run.
They're both weighing a last-minute bid for the Democratic nomination. What does that say about the state of the race? And is anyone really clamoring for more candidates? One of the biggest cases before the Supreme Court this term centers on the Dreamers, hundreds of thousands of people who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children. President Barack Obama used executive authority to protect the Dreamers from deportation. President Donald Trump used his executive authority to roll those protections back. Now it's up to the Supreme Court to decide the way forward. AP Supreme Court reporter Mark Sherman was in the room as the justices heard arguments in the case. Mark, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
So let's start with what this case is all about. What are the justices going to be deciding?
They're going to be deciding whether the way that the Trump administration has gone about trying to end the DACA program complies with federal law. There is in the background of the case this issue about whether DACA is legal in the first place, and the Trump administration says it isn't, or at least it probably isn't. But the real issue before the court is whether the way they've gone about trying to end it is itself legal.
And how did the Trump administration go about trying to end these protections for the Dreamers?
Well, there have been a couple of explanations over time, but the way it began was when then Attorney General Jeff Sessions said that he thought that DACA was illegal and unconstitutional. And that was basically used over at the Homeland Security Department to say, well, we have no choice. We can't continue a program that's illegal. And plus, we're probably going to get sued over it by Texas and other states, which had challenged an earlier expansion of DACA that occurred under the Obama administration and another program called DAPA that applied to parents of U.S. citizen children. And so the administration said, this program is probably illegal. We have to get rid of it. People went to court over that, universities, Dreamers themselves, immigrant advocacy groups, even Microsoft, on behalf of some of its employees. And they said, that's not right. That can't be. That threat of a lawsuit is enough to end the program. And the lower courts largely agreed. So then the administration came up with another rationale, which is basically that, look, we have a lot of discretion here. And even if we're wrong about whether this program is legal or not, we have ample discretion to end the program, just as the Obama administration had the discretion to begin it. So that's where we are.
So we're talking about presidential powers. We are talking about how a president can enact rules about who can come in and out of the country. But we are also talking in a very real way about the fate of people, in some cases, who have been in this country for years, who have grown up here, who have gone to school here, who are working here or serving in the military. How does that shape this debate? Some of these personal stories, some of the real emotion that is at the heart of this case?
Well, there was a lot of emotion in the briefs that were filed and a lot of personal stories. But in the courtroom today, there was very, very little of that. In fact, Justice Sotomayor was the only one who really made any mention of this. And she made a point where she concluded that the administration was trying to end this program and that it would destroy lives. That was really the most emotional moment in an otherwise fairly clinical discussion of the, legality, not so much the human stories behind it.
So this is a case that's going to be decided ultimately in the middle of a presidential election. Mark, I remember covering the Obamacare decision, which was decided in another presidential election with you. Give us your insights into the mindset of the court when these types of cases come up and they know that they're so heated politically and that they're going to be decided in the middle of an election. Does that weigh into their decision making at all?
I don't think think it necessarily weighs into the ultimate decision the court reaches, because after all, there are going to be people on either side of the outcome. Does it weigh whether they decide to take on the case? That's an interesting question. And of course, this is a case where the administration wanted the court to hear initially back in early 2018 and decide by the end of June of 2018. Well, instead, it's going to be 2020, and its delay basically is really the court's doing. The court put off making a decision about whether to take up this case for so long that when it finally did, it put it smack in the middle of the election campaign. So, the court acted for its own reasons, which it was looking to lower the temperature last term after the Kavanaugh confirmation. And now it finds itself deciding this issue and several other pretty high-profile issues right in the middle of the 2020 election campaign.
You were in the Supreme Court as the arguments over DACA were happening. Justice Roberts certainly is, as Chief Justice, someone we're always watching, but right now, given the makeup of the court, is particularly important. How did Roberts position himself on this case as you were hearing the arguments?
Well, my sense was that he seemed more likely than not to be on the side of the administration in this case. He didn't have any sort of, there was no dramatic moment, no aha moment where it was absolutely clear how he was going to come out. But he seemed to think maybe he thinks DACA itself is illegal. After all, he was on the court that heard the earlier case about DAPA, which was struck down. So it's not 100% certain, but that's certainly how it seemed to me. Now, the one caveat is that last year when the court heard arguments about the citizenship question on the 2020 census, Roberts seemed at the arguments then to be on the administration's side. And of course, as we know, a couple of months later, he wrote the decision saying the administration couldn't use the citizenship question on the 2020 census. So there's always a bit of a risk in predicting, but that's sure how it seemed today.
It's so fascinating. I love the tea leaf reading with the Supreme Court justices. So you mentioned Sotomayor. Give us some insight into some of the other justices and how they were positioning themselves, and what's your overall takeaway on where this case could go based on what you could read and glean from their questioning?
Again, this does seem to be the kind of case that could come out in that sort of typical conservative liberal split with the 5 conservatives on one side, the 4 liberals on the other. The conservatives just didn't seem to have too much trouble with what the administration wants to do. The rationale may not be the same for all of them. Some of them may think the court shouldn't even be in the business of reviewing a decision that's as discretionary as the administration says this is. Some of them may think that the rationale that the administration has put forward is good enough. On the liberal side, there was a lot of talk about how the rationales were not good enough, about how the administration hasn't taken sufficient account of the real costs of this decision, the human cost, the economic cost, the social cost, and, in the disruption that might be caused with people losing their jobs and perhaps being deported, at least in some cases. So that was the thrust of the liberals' questioning, but it didn't seem to make any headway among the conservatives.
Mark, as you have reviewed this case and the options before the justices, is there any kind of split the baby decision that they could make, or is this pretty zero sum? Either the administration has to keep the protections in place for the Dreamers, or those protections go away?
The Supreme Court is a place where you never say never about some sort of unusual outcome, because Roberts in particular has sort of been a master at finding some sort of middle ground that brings together more justices than you thought were possible, having watched the argument. This is a case, though, where almost no matter what the court decides, this is not a case about whether something's constitutional and therefore it has to be ended. This is a case where Congress, of course, we know, can step in at any time and put this program on solid legal footing. In fact, there's some people who think that Congress is waiting for, a court decision to do that. Even if the court finds that the administration can end DACA and that it did so legally, it doesn't mean that deportations are going to start immediately. It's quite possible that people who have 2 years worth of DACA protections will keep those protections, at least for some period of time. And that could take us past the election. It could even, in some cases, the full 2 years take us into 2022. So it's not as though everything's going to change overnight, although it would certainly bring a whole lot of uncertainty to a whole lot of people.
It's such a great point, Mark, because as with so many things in Washington, the ultimate solution could simply rest with Congress. We just don't see Congress acting on this issue, even though the Dreamers and the status of the Dreamers is something that you have Republicans and Democrats who have said that they want to help protect. But I think you're right that there are a lot of lawmakers who want to see what the court does here before they move forward, would clearly thrust this into the middle of the presidential campaign in a real way. Mark, before we wrap up here, just give our listeners a sense of what the other big cases are that you've either covered already or are coming up on the docket for the court that will be big political issues in 2020.
Well, the case that's coming next to the court, we don't know yet whether the justices will take it, but before the week is out, the president's supposed to file an appeal to block the subpoena that the Manhattan DA has issued to his accounting firm seeking his tax returns. So the lower court said that the accounting firm has to comply and that the president's arguments about why it don't hold much water. The accounting firm has said it will comply with whatever the court orders. They want a decision by the court by June. We don't know if the court will agree. And so that's one big case. There's a case that was argued last month about protections in federal civil rights law for LGBT people. We'll get a decision on that probably right in the midst of the campaign, probably not much before June. There's a case about guns coming up next month involving a very arcane New York City regulation, but it would be the court's first foray back into the issue of guns since 2010. And so there'll be a lot of attention beyond that. Of course, the Louisiana abortion clinic regulation.
Abortion,
law.
Absolutely.
This is not a case about when you can have an abortion. It's not one of those cases which are making their way but aren't here yet and not clear when they would be. This is a case about trying to regulate abortion clinics, and the clinic side says the purpose of this is to just make it harder for women to get an abortion. The states say that there are health reasons for these regulations. Why this case is important is because in 2016, the court struck down a virtually identical law in Texas. The only thing that's changed since then is the membership of the court with the retirement of Justice Kennedy, who is generally an abortion rights supporter.
So how's that for a hot topic list on the Supreme Court? Abortion rights, presidential powers, immigration. You have a busy couple months ahead. I really appreciate you taking the time, Mark, to be with us on Ground Game, and I do expect you to be back with us. I know our listeners will love getting your insights on all of these cases.
Well, that'll be fun.
When we come back, the historically large Democratic presidential field may be getting even bigger. It's November, but the Democratic presidential field is poised to get bigger, not smaller. Two candidates who initially decided against running are giving the 2020 race another look. Billionaire businessmen Michael Bloomberg and Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts. Here to help us make sense of what the heck is going on in the Democratic race is Steve Peoples, AP's national political writer. Hey, Steve, how you doing?
Hi, Julie. I'm doing well. How are you?
Okay. I have to admit, I do not like this idea of adding more candidates to our list instead of less. What is going on? Help us make sense of this.
Yeah, here we are less than 90 days before the Iowa caucuses. This list is definitely supposed to be getting smaller, and the opposite appears to be happening. So basically, this is a pretty loud sign that Democrats are concerned about the direction of this race, right? And that especially these top-tier candidates, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, might have trouble beating Donald Trump. At least that's what some establishment Democrats are talking about, to what some donors are talking about. And so there are some calls for fresh blood here.
So let's break this down, because there are two different dynamics happening here. We've got, on the one hand, some concern about Joe Biden's durability, and that really is rooted in the idea that some Democrats think that what he's pitching, the idea of a more moderate candidate who could reach across the aisle, is the way to beat Trump, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been interesting covering this campaign over the last year where, if you talk to voters, without fail, they all say that their number one priority is finding someone who can beat Donald Trump, right? There's a lot of voters thinking with their heads here that someone who occupies that moderate lane, and Joe Biden has occupied that lane throughout, But of course, Joe Biden has his weaknesses, right? He's older and he's stumbled at times, right? He's underwhelming out on the trail. I was actually at an event with him in Iowa a couple weeks ago where one voter fell asleep. So Joe Biden, he's occupying that centrist lane. But, establishment donors who want to rally behind him are somewhat concerned.
You mentioned Joe Biden's age. It's worth noting that Michael Bloomberg, 77, not exactly a spring chicken himself. He is somebody who has flirted with presidential ambitions for some time. We went through this earlier this year. We went through this in 2016. He's never really pulled the trigger. What are you hearing from Bloomberg sources? What are they saying about why this time might be different?
Yeah, I mean, I was covering Michael Bloomberg earlier this year when he was flirting with that id. And what he ultimately said at that time was that Joe Biden filled that and there just wasn't room for Bloomberg. Here we are, 7 months later, right? And because of Joe Biden's stumbles, he's very actively thinking about going a different direction, right? So I've been talking to Bloomberg World. It looks like he's leaning towards running here.
Talk a little bit about the strategy that Bloomberg would take here. It's unique because we are so close to those early states. He is saying that he would not compete in those traditional places, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Instead, he would flip to Super Tuesday, to some of the bigger states. Right. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, essentially, Michael Bloomberg is thinking about getting in here less than 90 days before voting begins. So it's just too late to compete in some of those early states. I mean, people like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren have been on the ground pounding the pavement there for essentially a year, right? So Bloomberg would not qualify for the November or December debates, probably, right? So if he's going to get there, he's going to have to go in a slightly different direction or a dramatically different direction, right? So Michael Bloomberg thinks that with his fortune, and yes, he has a fortune, Forbes put him at about $53 billion. With that fortune, he can essentially pound the airwaves, go heavy on TV and digital. Also, staff up in some of those Super Tuesday states to compete. Now, it's never quite been done before, right? So it would be an incredibly steep climb. I'm thinking back to Rudy Giuliani back in, 2008, where he talked about skipping New Hampshire.
Giuliani strategy.
Right.
How well that worked.
Exactly. So Michael Bloomberg has the financial resources to at least try, right?
Mm-hmm. It is one of those situations where you could only run that strategy if you have the money, and he does. The other candidate we heard about this week who's considering a late entry into the race is Deval Patrick. He's the former Massachusetts governor, someone who had also considered jumping in 2020, gave it a pass. At the time, he had cited the cruelty of the presidential process. He's going to have to get over that pretty quickly if he decides to jump in this race. Deval Patrick is someone who is very close personally to former President Barack Obama, has a lot of support from people in that Obama world who would be really excited to see him jump in. Steve, here's what I am wondering about, though. Are Democratic voters clamoring for more choices? What do you hear when you're out talking to voters?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was out on the trail in South Carolina a few days ago when this Michael Bloomberg news broke. I had some time before an event to just kind of poll folks sitting around. It was largely an African-American audience. Most of the voters hadn't heard of Bloomberg, but several others essentially said, we already have, 16, 17 candidates in here? But please no more, right? So there's hardly a cry on the ground for more candidates.
You do get the sense, Steve, that voters are happy with some of their choices. We have seen a historic number of Democrats who have jumped into this race. In early states, voters have really had a chance to put those candidates through the ringer. And we've ended up in a space where you've got a couple frontrunners, a couple others that are hanging around. But you do get the sense that voters are happy with their choices. Just put this, though, in historical context. Where are we right now as Democrats wait a late entry? How unusual would that be in our politics?
So, some candidates have literally been running for a year. John Delaney announced in 2018, right? So, candidates have just been swarming to Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada for so long. To have someone come along 3 months before voting begins is just unheard of. Because neither Patrick nor Bloomberg would qualify for those debates, it would be incredibly hard for them to win over those early state voters or Super Tuesday voters going forward. Really, history is working against both both men.
At the very least, it's going to keep it interesting for us. Steve Peoples, AP's chief political writer. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Julie.
That's it for this week's Ground Game from the Associated Press. We'll be here every Wednesday for the latest political news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.